Chapter 2 3 Days in Force. Due to reasons of ill health, and in accordance with Article 127 of the Soviet Constitution, all presidential powers have been transferred to Vice President of the USSR, Gennady Guneev. This short extract is from the statement given by the Gang of Eight at their 5 p.m. press conference on the first day of the coup, August 19th. This shorter instalment will be covering the events of the coup and everything that happened between August 18th and August 21st, 1991. This will be a mostly narrative account, with personal recollections interlinked throughout. The research for this is drawn mostly from primary sources, which were all referenced in the description below. On August 18th, the day prior to the putsch beginning, 4 of the plotters, including Gorbachev's trusted advisor, Valery Boldin, flew to Gorbachev's dacha in Crimea to meet with him. During this time, Kryuchkov had all 3 of Gorbachev's phone lines into the building secretly cut. Anatoly Chernayev, Gorbachev's aide, who was with him in Crimea throughout the coup, stated in his diary that Gorbachev's meeting with the 4 plotters lasted roughly 1 hour, with the president's head of security, Vladimir Medvedev, leaving with them, something that was highly unusual. Chernayev made the observation that Medvedev, quote, stood at his back and never left him anywhere. This time he went to Moscow. Gorbachev's head of security had betrayed him and had sided with the committee. Gorbachev told Chernayev after they'd left that he'd been given 2 options: to either transfer his powers to Vice President Guneev and agree to a state of emergency, or renounce his presidency. Gorbachev reportedly refused their proposal, later stating that he'd told them, quote, they were criminals who would be held accountable for their folly. Back in Moscow, and the 4 returned and met up with the rest of the emergency committee later that evening. KGB head Kryuchkov led this meeting, where they formalized their plans, which were to be revealed to the world the next day. Supposedly the Vice President Guneev had only recently been brought into these plans and was initially reluctant to sign on. He reportedly stated that he felt he didn't have the moral right or experience to carry out the presidential duties. He did eventually concede, though, under pressure from the other members. It's important to remember that if they couldn't get the president in on the plan, which they couldn't, they really needed the vice president to face this if they wanted any appearance of legitimacy. On the first morning of the coup, August 19th, the BBC correspondent to Moscow, Martin Sixsmith, recalled waking up to the music of Tchaikovsky and Chopin, replacing his usual TV and radio broadcasts. He stated this as, quote, "they're classical harbingers of grave news in the Soviet Union, as state media would flood with patriotic and historic entertainment during a time of crisis." Earlier that morning, with the help of Defense Minister Yazov, Guneev ordered tanks onto the streets of Moscow to intimidate and help secure the committee's power. A young soldier, by the name of Chuganov, recalled that angry protesters were shouting at them to turn around and go home on their way into Moscow. He recalled how his sergeant burst into his barracks in the middle of the night and how he initially thought it must have been some sort of training drill. Once he observed that they were all heading north into the city, a confused Chuganov feared that he was headed to a fate far worse than he ever thought possible. These sorts of stories help to explain to us why many of the soldiers were so hesitant to follow orders cracking down on their own people, with some even directly disobeying orders later on. Meanwhile, upon learning of the coup, Boris Yeltsin convened with other allies at the Russian White House around 9 a.m. that morning. There, he spent the rest of the day making phone calls to Western leaders and delivering speeches to the onlooking crowds of supporters, all of which had defied orders from the committee to clear the streets. It was this afternoon on August 19th that Yeltsin made his infamous remark that the committee were a, quote, right-wing, reactionary, anti-constitutional coup, while stood atop a parked tank. Later that evening, the conspirators held the press conference referenced earlier. Guneev, who acted as the face, appeared nervous and perhaps even drunk. His hands were trembling, and he seemed almost apologetic in his delivery, promising that their rule was temporary. Around this time, and after much anticipation, the US President Bush also finally commented on the apparent coup underway in the world's second great superpower. In a move which the former US Ambassador Jack Matlock Jr. disagreed with, Bush decided that the most likely outcome here would be the coup's success. Therefore, not wanting to, quote, burn our bridges with them, Bush initially spoke welcomingly of the plotters and assured the world that he expected them to maintain the status quo of cooling tensions. However, it is worth mentioning that Bush later on reversed his position on the emergency committee, but this was only once its failure had become apparent. The next day, August 20th, has been considered a moment of reprise for the protesters, as any attack launched by the army was likely to take place at night. On that topic, by the afternoon of the 20th, Operation Thunder, the plan by the plotters to storm the White House and arrest or kill Yeltsin and his allies, was finalized, scheduled for 3 a.m. the next morning. However, as time passed on, Defense Minister Yazov found general after general telling him that they were not prepared to go forward with the attack. It was also around this time that cracks within the Soviet armed forces began to appear. The head of the Air Force, Yevgeny Shaposhnikov, is quoted to have said, "Let the sons of bitches comment on what they are going to do with this country," when questioned by a journalist on his thoughts about the emergency committee. Meanwhile, now acting President Guneev spent the afternoon in contact with Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, whom he promised to restore good relations with. As is a recurring theme, you might notice, just like with Castro earlier, the committee were making lots of promises to lots of people with very little way of backing them up. Back in Crimea, Gorbachev spent the rest of his day listening to a Sony transistor radio, which he had hidden. Chernayev stated in his diary that Gorbachev's mood was constantly in fluctuation depending on whatever the latest news was from the radio. Back in Moscow, that afternoon the leaders of the individual republics, such as Ukraine among others, finally began to condemn the coup after some hesitation. As per a later court hearing, in a meeting between the plotters that evening, Guneev shocked his colleagues by telling them of rumours he had heard about a plan to attack the White House. He demanded they release a statement immediately, explaining how this was untrue. This just tells us how out of touch Guneev was, but also how relatively uninvolved he must have been, to not have even been aware of any plans Khrushchev and the army had been making. Around this time, the plotters also had another one of their bubbles burst. To win over the Soviet public, they had planned to fill the shop shelves with military stockpiles of food. However, it was soon discovered that this would not be possible, as these military reserves were not anywhere near what they thought they were. There was barely enough there to keep the army fed for a few weeks. Later that evening, in a watershed moment, just before midnight, 3 protesters were shot and killed after clashes with soldiers. These 3 young men were Dmitry Komar, Vladimir Usov, and Ilyich Krychevsky. By the early hours of the 21st, it was fast becoming clear that the coup was unravelling. Yazov had continuously failed to gain support from the other generals to storm the White House, and with Yeltsin still free, the committee would be unable to stamp their authority. KGB commander and head of the elite Alpha Group, Viktor Karpukin, was one of these men tasked with storming the White House. He later stated that he refused to do so, saying, quote, the whole thing would have been over in 15 minutes. Thank God I couldn't bring myself to do it. It would have been a bloodbath. I refused. While without supporting evidence, this may have been a fabrication to make himself a hero. What is certain is that the Alpha Group never did take part in the storming of the White House, and Yeltsin was left unharmed and free. Commander of the Soviet Air Force, Shaposhnikov, also had his men placed onto high alert, and considered a retaliatory air raid on the Kremlin if the White House was stormed. A civil war was at stake, and thankfully the committee were not prepared to lead the country down that path. Their bluff had been called out on. Furthermore, with news of the deaths of 3 protesters the evening before spreading, the mood was shifting, and civilians dug in, preparing to defend Yeltsin with their lives. When the journalist David Remnick spoke to a middle-aged woman on the streets the previous evening, she told him, quote, "I'll let a tank roll over me if I have to. I'll die right here if I have to." With nowhere else to go, the plotters knew they had no choice but to instigate all-out violence or give in now. However, this sentiment amongst the committee was not clear to the protesters. Martin Sixsmith described the early hours of the 21st as the lowest point of liberal morale. It was around this time, though, that Kryuchkov called the White House and admitted defeat. After hanging up, Yeltsin's aide Gennady Berberis is reported to have turned to him and said, "It's okay now. You can go to sleep." Shortly after this, the news was sent out across a megaphone to crowds outside. Martin Sixsmith described this moment as uproar, a welling up of emotion that took your breath away. By mid-morning, still nothing had been heard of from the coup leaders, and it was possible that it had all been false rumours. That was until 2 p.m, when the tanks finally began to depart, and it was clear that it was all over. Boris Pugo, Marshal Sergey Akhromeyev, and Nikolai Krachina all committed suicide for reasons relating to the coup's failure in the short aftermath. The others, except Guneev, headed for Crimea to meet with Gorbachev. Anatoly Lukyanov travelled separately, though, attempting to feign innocence. Gorbachev refused to speak with any of them.